Thanks for joining us again this afternoon, guys. We're here to talk about application modernization and some of the approaches that we can take when we really try to modernize our legacy applications and uplift some of the older technologies in our organization. With me today, I've got Jack Marchetti, and did I say that right, Jack?
You did,
Excellent.
Thank you.
And Jeremy Smart joining me. And we're going to talk about an approach with serverless technologies. And this is a huge subject, so we're not going to go end to end on it, but we're going to try to touch all the salient points in there that can help build a solution and some of the reasons why you might want to go with serverless architectures. So that being said, Jack, Jeremy, thanks for joining me. I'm going to start off really quickly with kind of a high-level question here, and that is, what can serverless really do for us? What kind of problems does it solve for an organization? And what are some of the business drivers that would really drive us to try to create something here?
I mean, I could jump in to quickly go over some things that got me excited about serverless and some of the benefits. Speed being one of them. And I don't mean speed of your code. I mean speed of getting things done and getting them deployed quickly without having to worry about infrastructure, provisioning for your worst potential day on Black Friday ahead of time and provisioning all that that hardware ahead of time. You can deploy, individual small pieces of functionality quickly, since they're on demand, right? They run when they're needed. They don't run when they're not, right? So insofar as if you do them correctly, costs should be lower. Since something like Lambda, right? They're functions, right? You're writing small pieces of code that do one single thing, right? So building these things out allows you to build things out more quickly, get things to market faster, and ideally, if done correctly, will lower your costs. So there's a few things that check all three of those boxes that I don't think anyone would not want. Jeremy, by all means, jump in.
Yeah, so one thing that happens is companies will build a piece of software, and it's a nice little piece of software, and then it's going really well and they want more features, and so they add more features, but they have to go quickly because people want them now. So they add more and they add more and they add more, and then you end up with what's called a monolith in software architecture, which is one giant piece of software that does everything for your business. And the issue there is not all of the functionality within that piece of software is as demanding. So you could have an administration function that takes very little computing power, but then another one that is, doing DNA sequencing and requires an incredible amount of compute power, but your admin system has to scale with that because you've only got this one piece of software. So serverless gives you kind of a different mentality around how to build software. It's about building all three major clouds, essentially call them functions. So the idea is you build one function, you build one piece of functionality, and you put it into the serverless architecture, and it does one thing. Maybe a good example of that is, let's say you send out an email flyer and you have 1 million subscribers. If you have an admin API in your monolith and you do that, it's going to be pretty taxing on your system. Instead, what you can do is just build out a serverless function that emails 1 million people, and it doesn't have to do it all in one run. You can do it asynchronously as well. So maybe you have 500 different instances of your function all running at the same time, and each one emails 1,000 people. So what it allows you to do is kind of pull out the things that do require scaling into a very compact and isolated solution that doesn't affect the rest of your solution.
So just to kind of summarize a little bit too then is, Jack, you kind of focused on, it's really a speed to market as well as the ability to kind of decouple some of these functions away from these old monoliths and create independent architectures. And Jeremy, you kind of hit on the idea that it's infinitely scalable because you can take that small little piece of function code and continually grow it so that you can react to business need or consumer need at will.
Yeah. Not only in terms of workload, but in terms of functionality as well. So the idea is you go, all right, we've got this emailer, but we also need functionality that once someone is emailed, we track whether they click it. And so we can have a function specifically for tracking whether people click the email. And it allows you to grow out functionality in a very compartmentalized way without affecting that email code, without breaking the email code. A lot of times what you see with big monolithic architectures is you do one thing and something else breaks, and it becomes very fragile, and you become afraid as an organization to innovate.
Yeah.
And using serverless can kind of get you away from that mentality.
Yeah, the individual pieces are, I always kind of talk about it in terms of Legos as a kid. You just take Legos and pile them all together. So if you're doing something, something we recently did with some POC stuff around EventBridge, where you can, within AWS, EventBridge is an eventing architecture. You create event buses, and then through configuration, not code, you can filter individual messages to send to whatever your target is. So a lot of times those targets are individual Lambda functions, right? So my invoice system is a Lambda function, right? Or my process and send to Redshift or something like that is a Lambda function, right? And each of these things are individual and don't affect the other, right? And then you can build another Lambda function that when messages fall off or don't get processed, they go into a DLQ, and then you process them through the DLQ Lambda function, right? So starting to think of your architecture, your application into individual pieces and not one giant thing that is very slow to update, very slow to deploy. And since all of them are individually scalable and can handle the demand as they come in, so if the invoice system is getting a ton of traffic, it's not going to affect the other function in theory. So when you start thinking about it that way, like that's the stuff that gets me really excited about serverless, and the fact that like I never liked configuring hardware. I'm a software guy, right? Give me code, let me deploy it, and not have to think about the underlying hardware. And so, like I said, that all ties back into the speed at which you can deploy this stuff and get it out there.
That's two big points that you hit there, right? Is some of the things that you can do that you couldn't do before, right? Is one, you aren't worrying about the architecture or the hardware necessarily behind it. You're developing code. You're focusing on solving the business problem, not on the security of the OS or patching.
Right.
The other thing too is that you're separating out the functionality. So somebody wants to build a specific widget. You're focusing just on that widget and not impacting. You don't have that problem of the stone creating ripples in the pond, right? If we throw that stone and we create that new functionality, it's not really affecting that much more.
Right.
It's just going to be within that specific stack.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing that serverless, at least mostly solves, is the snowflake problem, where you've got, you're managing 5 servers, and each of these servers has an operating system and a configuration associated with it, and your junior developer goes in and he starts tinkering with one of the servers, and suddenly what you have is a divergence in your infrastructure that can cause issues. It can be very difficult to track down what's going wrong. You can't really do that with serverless. You're going to have one configuration for a function, and every instance of that function is going to have that same configuration. So it helps solve that problem.
So configuration drift and really even just deployment drift. You're going to stick with a standardization across that entire function.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, and then another thing I often bring up with serverless is it's not necessarily just tied to, little pieces of functionality that you're writing. Things like DynamoDB, which is a managed NoSQL offering from AWS, Cosmos DB in Azure. Those are both serverless. You're never actually managing a server underneath, right? S3, like file storage, things along those lines that you never actually have to touch the underlying hardware, which if you follow what, I always try and say, like, what is AWS focusing on, and they're often telling you where they want you to go with things, right? And the idea of managed services and serverless is definitely where I think the future of things are going, definitely where they want you to go to. If you take their developer associate certification, it might as well be called the serverless developer associate exam, because it's entirely about Lambda, DynamoDB, and things along those lines. They want to get you away from worrying about hardware and deploying EC2 instances. And, as someone who hates hardware, that's music to my ears. So no offense to anyone who likes hardware.
So one challenge with moving over to serverless is you kind of have to think about things a little bit differently. You look in particular at Azure Functions or Lambda. It can be tricky because you're not building software the same way. You've got to think in terms of, all right, this is a stateless function. I'm not going to be able to transition that state in a way that I'm used to other functionality.
Right.
So whereas before you might build an MVC app and the controller gets your session state, and then it can pass that to whatever it needs to, say a repository layer or whatever, and then it writes to a database. And then you need to do something else like email people, and you still have that state. And so you can kind of just do everything in one place, and it's really easy. You've got to think about things a little bit differently with Lambda or with Azure Functions, because that's just not how it's going to work. There are capabilities in between Lambda or Azure Functions where you can pass some stateful object. So in the case of AWS, you can use SNS and SQS to tell other functions what to do. So a lot of times whenever you have an API endpoint, what you actually have is a workflow behind the scenes. And Azure Functions or Lambda allows you to have really complex, really decoupled workflows, but you've got to be okay with those being so decoupled. Whereas before you could manage everything internally, you could have a bunch of if-then statements to handle your workflow. You can't really do that when you're using functions. So instead, you've got a separate function for each capability. You can use something like step functions to manage your workflow.
Yep.
Or you can manage that workflow entirely through SNS and SQS, right, through who's subscribing and who's doing work there.
And what you're really talking about there is almost not just a decoupling of the technologies, but it's a decoupling of the business logic behind the technology or in front of the technology, right?
Right.
We can separate out a lot of that technological function requirement, but when we start putting those pieces together and trying to create that DNA that makes up these bigger applications, you still need something to manage that business logic. And
yes,
that's right, beyond what a serverless architecture really does for you. You've got to build some of that lattice work around that serverless to really make use of it.
And it can be good too, because a lot of times when you're writing if-then statements in a monolith, you're not really thinking about the business workflow. And what serverless really requires you to do is be really explicit about what that is.
Right.
And think about it a little bit more. And it allows you to be a little bit more organized, a little bit more deliberate about how you're executing your business. And so you can kind of end up getting some benefit out of there. And you might even say, hey, maybe we can do this a little bit better.
That's a perfect segue actually for something I wanted to get into with both of you as well, though, and Jack, maybe you can take the first stab at this one for us, but how do you define success then, right? I mean, we're talking about some of the problems and challenges that you can get into and some of the really benefits of moving over to serverless and how you can get better functionality and such, but how do you actually define success when you start decoupling applications like this and creating a true serverless or event-driven architecture?
Sure. I mean, I think it depends on where you're coming from, right? Like if you're in a shop that you're dealing with a monolith and you don't really have a good dev pipeline, and the way you deploy code or something like that is DLLs are copy and pasted to a bunch of different servers and it's very slow and things along those lines, breaking off different pieces of that monolith into isolated functionality that run in Lambda or Azure Functions or Google Cloud Functions, things like that. Your speed to deliver features should be increasing. If it's not, then you're probably doing something incorrectly, right? So, I keep harping back on the, just the speed at which these things can be deployed, because you're not worried about, you talk about solid principles, right? And the S is single, right? So having something that has a single focus, a function that does this does this alone and does this well, right? And being able to deploy things like that and manage that without having to worry about all the other baggage and dependencies that you sometimes get with a monolith leads to the speed. I'd have to think about other metrics for success. Jeremy, have you got some?
That's actually right.
I think one other thing I would say too is, at least for me personally, right, as former developer, if you will, being able to take functionality, get it working, seeing it work, seeing it scale quickly, right? Like I can send 10,000 hits at this thing and watch it scale and not see it break. Exciting stuff, right? So if your developers start getting excited about this stuff, right, and they want to use not necessarily the latest and greatest, but these new things, right, they're going to get excited about the work they're doing. And ideally, when I'm excited about something, I typically do it better and want to do it more, right? So your development teams may also, the productivity there could increase as well, because they're no longer working on something that's 20 years old, and they're working on something that when they go to AWS reInvent and everyone's talking about, now they're actually working on stuff like that. So getting developers excited, I think, is another potential measure of success there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important to have your developers very engaged with the technology solutions you're developing. Otherwise, you're not going to get that agility that Jack is talking about. You're not going to get that increased time to market. It can be difficult to keep up with the technology treadmill, but if you don't, your business suffers. If you stagnate, you wait 20 years before you start innovating.
Right.
Don't expect to turn around and start innovating within a year. It's
Right.
very difficult to get yourself out of that hole. So staying ahead of it, having your developers be excited about the latest and greatest can be a benefit. But I think it's also important to think about things in terms of business objectives. Really being excited about technology is great, but it's got to solve a business problem. There's got to be a pain point there. So one of the pain points that Jack brought up is time to market. The business or our customers want X implemented. Why is it taking us 6 months? They asked for it 6 months ago. We haven't moved on it. Why? Well, because we haven't been innovating. And so those two things really go hand in hand. It could be that there are too many outages. So we want to utilize the high availability and reliability of the cloud. So that's a business driver for why we would want to move towards a serverless architecture, and it kind of always has to be there. It could be that the business really wanted to implement a capability, but the technology just couldn't support it. They went to their architects. The architects said, "There's no way we can do that. It would cost us millions of dollars. It just can't happen." So being able to utilize something like serverless can allow you to get there and allow you to achieve those business objectives. And that's really how I would measure success, going back to your original question. Are we getting things to market faster? Are we getting our customers the functionality they're looking for? Have we created a more reliable system that our customers put more trust in? Those types of questions, I think, are really core to how you measure success. And I would say really that's what it comes down to, is making sure the business is happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you both hit kind of some of the high points there too, is just, speed to market. Can we get a product out faster, a feature out faster? Is our team engaging and doing something innovative, which is always key, right? I mean, if we have an excited team working toward a combined goal, we're going to end up getting somewhere faster. And
Right.
a large part of that is getting that bias reaction, right? Getting our teams to actually want to make change rather than getting stuck in the quagmire of, well, if we change something, we're going to break something. And getting
Right.
away from that idea is critical to making sure that you're innovative in any way, shape, or form. So that's awesome.
And to that point, I would say, business is always trying to innovate. But if they don't invest the resources into innovating on the IT side, they're going to fail. You've really got to go hand in hand there.
Yeah. And if I take the other side of that, right, instead of if you don't do this, you're going to fail, to succeed, one of the big things that we want to try to get to is what's kind of the story of an organization from starting from nothing, and they're in this old legacy monolithic stance, and they've got everything centrally located, and how do they take that first step on the path? And how have we seen some of the more successful projects that we've worked through get from that start into a successful point where they're going faster to market and providing more agility to their teams and really creating an ecosystem within their organization to provide new functionality and new business features to market faster?
So if I can jump in here, one of the keys is to have alignment between the business and the technologists on that. We need to go faster. We need to get to market faster. You've got to have buy-in on the core fundamental reasoning for why you're making the change before the change can happen successfully. I've seen this change happen successfully at a large client. They have a monolith with kind of a traditional architecture. They've got servers, they've got databases, they've got an API, etc. But they weren't really able to get features out fast enough, and they did get stuck in that quagmire you're talking about. So the first key part was the technologists were excited about making the change. The business was excited about making the change. So all the key stakeholders are there. They're all in the same boat. And then it's about really coming up with a plan that isn't swallowing the ocean. So come up with maybe one thing first that you can do. Let's try to do one thing in Lambda, for example, and let's see success there. And when everybody gets a taste of that success, it becomes easier to kind of get the ball rolling with the rest of your architecture. My recommendation definitely would be pick something off that's definitely been a pain point. Maybe it takes too long to run. It fails a lot for lots of different reasons, and see if you can do that successfully. And once you can do that, then you also have kind of a pattern to go forward with future implementations, and you've got lessons learned. So, well, maybe we didn't quite get it the first time on this, but at least we can iterate now. So that's what I've seen at successful clients is they're able to kind of learn from their mistakes. They've got all the stakeholders in the same boat, moving in the same direction, and they're willing to put in the work and some of the pain when you do switch technologies and when you're trying something new. And then as you get more comfortable, it's going to get easier. And I think if you do it that way, you'll start to see business benefit immediately. You don't have to wait 6 months or a year for the entire monolith to be rebuilt on a new platform. Just pick off a piece, get some easy wins, and get the ball rolling.
So the big thing for you then is really to kind of focus on that business and technology alignment. Find that small piece of functionality that you can break off and decouple, and have a really short-term milestone that you can show some success and iterate upon, and then reuse that pattern as you move forward.
Yeah, you can get it done in a quarter. If you're still kind of struggling, maybe it takes you 2 quarters, but I think that's about what you want to shoot for. No more than 2 quarters on having some sort of business objective be achieved by what you're doing. I think that's like if you can show that, then the business is going to get more excited about it. They see the benefits, and it just snowballs. It's a snowball effect.
Nice. And Jack, I apologize, I cut you off there.
Oh, no problem, no problem. I would just say, like, I completely agree with Jeremy, and like kind of what we're talking about here is something called like the strangler pattern, where you kind of break off these little pieces of the monolith, and before you know it, there's not much left of the monolith and it gets strangled away, kind of thing. So I think that's a totally valid and more likely realistic way of taking something that, has been done the same way for 20 years and, trying to modernize it. But I also think, I'm a big fan of ambitious goals. And so if someone at the top basically says like we're going to move our entire core something to Lambda and serverless in 12 months, right? And everyone's going to look at them and say, you're absolutely out of your mind. We can't do that, yada, 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 right? But that, if someone at the top is thinking like, we have to move and we are moving now, we're not going to wait, we're not going to, do some POCs and, we're going to think about it. And maybe we're going to have to read some white papers, right? We are moving now, get on the bus, right? And I think having that top-down approach can drive people, right? Like when JFK said we're going to the moon, right? He said we're going to the moon. He didn't say, well, first we're gonna figure out suborbital, flight, and then we're gonna figure out, how do we then land on them? It was like we're going there and let the other smart people figure out how to get there, right? And so I think starting small obviously is probably the easiest approach, and it depends on the maturity of the development team as well. But I'm a big fan of if the top down, the CTO or even the CEO looked at what they had and said, like, we are falling behind and we got to go, and just said 12 months we're gonna, and then they probably realize in the back of their head can't be done in 12 months, right? But let's see where we're at in 12 months, and we're probably going to be in a better place than we were if you didn't set such an ambitious goal. So I'm a big fan of ambitious goals.
Oh, set that big ambitious goal, right?
Yeah.
Say that we're going to go to the moon, but then give the direction to your directors and to your teams that, hey, I need 100 milestones between here and there that we can achieve. Tell me how we're going to get to the moon.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think a blend of both what Jack and I are saying makes sense. I think it's good to have that ambitious goal, but show success along the way.
Yeah,
if you get to the end of that 12 months and everybody feels like a failure, I don't think that's necessarily the approach you want to take.
Well,
Sure.
Yeah, and it's never about the big bang, right? We all know it. Every project that goes in and says we're going to move a $20 million product in 12
Right.
months, it's never going to happen in $20 million or 12 months.
Right.
But we can achieve probably 90% of the results that are required in a half the amount of money if we really focus on the things that are important to the business, right?
Yeah.
And focus on those things that are achievable and that we can build around.
Yep.
So one thing Jack does better than me is thinks about serverless, the big picture of serverless, where you've got databases and you've got, it's not just compute. But a good example of misused serverless is having long running functions. So they're not designed to run for 15 minutes. They're designed to run for 30 seconds or less. So you've got to think about use cases when you decide, is serverless right?
When we use serverless, they're really kind of purpose-built containers, right?
Yeah.
Public cloud providers provide us. And finding the right business use case to fit with the right technical use case is going to be critical in building your serverless architecture. If we were going to summarize this in kind of like the easy button from going from monolith into serverless, and we could line it up in like 5 steps or 10 steps to give everybody an idea of this is your step 1 and step 2, what would that look like?
I think Jack and I will have different opinions on this. I'm curious to hear his.
I would just try and find a piece of an application. If we're talking about going from the monolith, like what's a pain point that is sort of like not necessarily an external part of the monolith, because nothing's external really, but what's easier, something in there that you can chop off and independently build, right? And perhaps something that you're having scaling issues with, perhaps you're having something that's slow to innovate on, it's causing you a lot of problems related to hardware and things along those. So anything that would, potentially be in that boat, right? Identify that, right? Look at that. How can you break that down into smaller pieces, right? Can you break that down into individual functionality pieces, right? And then kind of go from there, right? Then it's, well, does this thing potentially need its own data store, right? Okay, maybe we use something like Dynamo with that, right? Now we have this wholly segmented off piece that we can start working on, and you're off and running potentially, right? So what do you think, Jeremy?
So Jack, just to kind of summarize real quick before I kind of go forward then, if I was going to put that into like steps, right, it's almost just 3 of them. It's picking the right workload, the right business objective.
Yeah.
It's identifying and picking the right data sources for that workload to
Sure.
ensure that you've got alignment there. And then the third is really just starting the development and testing and use cases for it.
Right. And then I would also potentially add to that, and this kind of goes against my previous point of big ambitious goals, but pick something that you're going to have success with early. Right. So if you can pick something off that's not going to, like, you're not going to take the entire core functionality of like the monolith and break that off immediately. Right. Because it's going to be too hard. You're going to fail at it too often and people are going to get discouraged. Right. So if you can pick something else off that, is a, not necessarily a critical workload, but something critical, right? And get that working potentially in a serverless setting, or even something minor, right? Like we talked about earlier, just, email marketing stuff, right? Not that there's anything wrong with email marketing, but like if you could take something off that could be completely isolated off and just now that thing is completely separate and you don't have to worry about it. Right. So, and if you can show quick success with that, that will lead them to further success.
So what Jack is saying is something I've been thinking about a little bit. It's not a one-size-fits-all path forward. It largely has to do with the business's aversion to risk. Yep. It has to do with their current environment and even the type of business they do. You've got something where lives are at risk. Let's say you're a medical provider, and if this system goes down, people's lives are in the balance. You've got to think about that stuff. And what Jack is talking about is taking a low risk piece first for businesses like that. It could be that the risk is for your business. Maybe you're a shipping business and you just can't get your orders out, right? So the risk there is doing nothing as your business fails. So in that case, you're going to want to go bigger. You're going to want to take a more core piece of functionality to your business and get that working. So I would say there isn't a singular path forward there. I think you've got to think about the environment you're in as well.
And that really talks about that aligning business to technology, right? And making sure that you've aligned the risk versus reward mentality to it so that whatever you pick is that first step, right? The first step we're saying is really pick the right workload, making sure that you pick that based on not just the technology requirements, but the business requirements as well.
And once you've picked that workload, there's going to be an uplift for your people. Most likely it's going to be something completely new for them. It's going to be a learning experience. And serverless really lends itself to more of an agile environment. Yep. Getting to market faster lends itself to a more agile environment. And if you're working in waterfall, which a lot of organizations, whether they want to admit it or not, are, right. It can be a tough uplift and a tough implementation. So you've got to think about your processes too. How are we actually getting software into the wild? And take this opportunity of moving to serverless as an opportunity to improve your processes around DevOps. Not only just the development part, the entire pipeline from the business requirements all the way to software and releases. And I think that's an important part of actually implementing serverless successfully.
So really, I think we're coming down to that is that the first step is really identifying the right workload, but the second one is look at the process in which you work on these workloads, right? Let's make sure that we've got the right approach, the right process inside, and the right ambitions for how we want to present ourselves and how we want to work on these things. And from there, it's really just a technology uplift, or is there more, you think?
It's not still. So you've got to, again, managing risk is important here. Let's say you just have a cutover. Bam, we're done. We're on serverless now. Wait a minute, nothing works. What went wrong? That's right. Not really a technology issue. That's a risk management issue. It's a foresight issue. So thinking about what does that transition from what we have now to where we want to be look like, and how do we do it smoothly? So thinking about that is important as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to it, if you're a company right now and you have this giant monolith and you've missed several iterations of new technology along the way and you're still doing things in something that was done 10 years ago, like your problems are plentiful in the tech world, but it's most likely a culture and business problem, right? The table's not being set correctly to get people to and a lot of times, like, I think companies look at it, well, I don't need to, like, this is all generating revenue for me and I don't need to, like, why am I going to spend money and time and effort upgrading something that technically doesn't need to be? And like I say about a lot of things, everything works until it doesn't, right? And then someday something's going to break and then that breaks other things. And then you try and fix that. And then you realize you just have this 20 years of issues that piled on top of each other. And at that point, when you're thinking about modernizing, it's very late in the game, and it's going to take you a lot more time and a lot more money to get to where you want to be rather than along the way iterating. So
I think we just kind of hit the nail on the head there with you, Jack, is that it really comes down to there's kind of two pieces to this, right? A large part of any kind of modernization effort is going to become cultural and risk management as well as process management. The technology management, yes, is an important piece. And a large part of the approach, though, is going to be identifying where some of your technical backlog and let's call it technical debt is, but also on identifying some of that cultural debt that you'll need to uplift to ensure that your organization is ready to absorb these new technology changes.
Right, and keeping in mind as well, and this is also part of AWS's well-architected framework, is when you identify, we're going to be moving these workloads, right? And some guy in ops had been working on that workload, like that's what his job was, right? He was an admin and he worked on this particular piece, and you're suddenly like, well, we're changing your job, right? And keeping in mind that, like, well, no, there's a place for him in the cloud. There's a place for him in the app modernization, and he probably wants to be brought along there, right? So training the employees, getting them excited about it, and not letting them think, we're going to do all this and then you're all out of a job, right? Because that's not what's going to happen. There's going to, just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean you're going to eliminate roles and things like that. You're probably going to need to add more roles potentially, right? Or add new, capabilities, right?
I'm just going to reiterate what Jack said because I think it's really important. That cultural piece is so if your business looks at IT as a cost center, don't expect them to get much done for you. I'd say really look at them as a business partner. You've got business objectives to achieve, and they can help you achieve them. And changing that frame of mind, I think, is really important. I think Jack's point to people can be afraid of change because it means, like, this is what I do, this is what I know.
Right.
Investing in your people is really important. Say, we get this is new for you. We're willing to train you up on it. We're willing to increase that skill set so that you can be valuable to us and you can increase your marketability. And it's a win-win. It's a win for the business. It's a win for the employee. So I think that's really important. And investing in your people, looking at IT as more than just a cost center. And I think that's going to increase your probability of success.